In this episode, we're going to start to tackle the basics of unit testing or feature testing your application. For some of you, this may be an entirely foreign concept. We're going to cover the basics of it, and it does take some time to get into the workflow of actually testing your application. So in a normal flow, you would normally write some code and then you manually test that it does what you think that it's supposed to do. This is what we would consider basically manual testing. Wouldn't it be great if you could write tests for your entire application that tested every single feature from top to bottom? And then you can automate it and just run that over and over as you're changing code, making sure that you haven't broken something else. I mean, how many times have you made a change and then with something that seemed completely unrelated breaks? And you're not quite sure why, if you change this one thing, why something on the other side of the application broke. Well, of course, everything has consequences. But when we are manually testing, it's a very focused kind of testing, but we are only really concerned with what we are changing. However, when you change your code, there are repercussions. And so because of that, it could damage another part of your application. And this is where testing really shines. Because testing, because it's automated, it can run through every single test and test everything in your application in a single shot, which is something that is completely impossible to do in a manual way. So if you've been following along the entire time with this course, then you do know that we installed Telescope. If you installed Telescope in your project, Telescope needs to be disabled before we can actually run this. So these next couple of steps are only for those of you that have Telescope installed. So let me jump into the terminal and let's run vendor bin/PHPUnit. This will run PHPUnit. Now, out of the box, PHPUnit is set up with Laravel. And PHPUnit is the library that we're going to use for testing our application. However, if you run this and you have Telescope, it will not work. It will fail. And the reason for that is due to recent changes with the environment file. And what we really need to do is just disable it for testing. You really don't need Telescope at all for testing. So let's go back to PHP Storm. Again, this is only if you have this installed in your machine. So in the root directory, let's go to a file called phpunit.xml and let's add a new line here for telescope_enabled. And let's set that to false. Hit save, then go back and let's run vendor bin PHP again. And if you get green, great. We are good to go. So it says that it ran 2 tests and it says that it had 2 assertions. Assertions are when you are basically comparing what you expect something to be against what your application gave you back. For example, you may say, well, if I do this, then I expect to see this particular record in the database. So we would say that's an assertion. It's just a word for saying that you made sure that something was true or equal or null or whatever the comparison is, that was true. So that is an assertion. Now each test is just a function. Let me show you. Let's go back to PHP Storm and let's go into our test directory. Now this is the nice thing with Laravel. Everything comes set up out of the box. So inside tests, you do have a features folder and a unit folder. For now, we're just going to worry about the features directory. Let's open up this example test.php. So this right here is a test. And the way a test is written is that it either needs to start with the word test or it needs to have a special annotation up here at the top. Something like this. When you have this special annotation, then you can just write whatever method name you want. Now, me personally, I do like my method names basically being very large, very verbose, because you really do want to know what that test is supposed to be testing. So something like test 1, that's not good enough for a test name. It needs to be something like a new user gets an email when it registers. That is a proper function name for a test. Anything that is not descriptive of what that test does is not good enough for testing. So just make sure you have nicely written tests. So we have this example test. It doesn't really do anything, but we do see that it tries to do a GET request to so basically our home page, and it just makes sure that we get a status of 200. Let's go ahead and change this file up. I want to put one of our controllers under a test. So let's work through this together. Let's open up our HTTP, and the controller that I'm thinking of is my customer controller. Obviously, my customer controller is nice and clean, and everything in here, I believe, right now, does everything that it's supposed to do. So this is what we would call backfilling the test. Typically, you would write the test alongside with your actual implementation. But because we were not talking about testing, we're going to have to backfill a test for the customer's controller. So I want to write a couple of tests to test what customer's controller is actually doing. So let me go ahead and rename this test right here. Let's say refactor rename. Just name it customers test. All right, so we'll go ahead and rename that. Let's get rid of all of this right here, and let's start a new test. All right, so what would be a typical test that we actually run in our application? Well, how about this? If I click on customer list, I want to make sure that if I'm not logged in, that we are redirected to the login page. So let's go ahead and work through this to see how we can make that work. So let's write a new test for only logged in users can see the customer's list. How about that? So that is one test that we need to make sure. We need to make sure that if somebody tries to fetch that page, we need to make sure that they are redirected. So we'll say response equals, and we'll say this. There is a helper built into this test case that we can use, and we're going to say go ahead and get the following route. So what is the route that we are looking for? Well, this route right here is just /customers. So we're going to go to /customers, and then I want to assert a redirect. And where are we redirecting to? Login. It's that simple. We're going to fetch this URL, and then I want to assert that we actually end up in logged in. All right, let's try that and see how it goes. Let's copy this, run back here, and then run vendor bin PHPUnit -- filter, and then paste our method name. And there we go. We have one test, and it's passing. Great. So now let's change this code so we can see that fail. So let's go back here and see how we can do that. Well, simple enough. If we just disabled this middleware, then it is no longer required for that. So I'm going to disable that. Let's go back to the test and run it again. And we fail. Okay, and why did we fail? We failed because the response status code of 200, which is obviously just a correct response, is not a redirect status code. Great. So that's it. That is our first test. How exciting is that? So let's go back here. Let's turn on authentication again, and then run our test one more time. And sure enough, we are back to green. Now, I like to run clear right before every test, like so. That way, every time I run my suite, we get a nice clean screen. So from here on out, that's just what I'm running right before. All right, let's keep going with this test. Let's test some more stuff. So now that we are testing that if you are not logged in, you cannot see that page, let's do the inverse. Let's make sure that if we are logged in, then we can view that list. Great. So let's write a new test and say authenticated users can see the customer's list. So how do we do that? Well, there is a nice helper in Laravel, and we can say this acting as. So we're going to be acting as a particular user. This brings in an entirely new concept of testing. So basically what you would want to do is you would normally not want to use the same database that you use for your actual development for testing. So what you can actually do is set up an in-memory database instead. But this database is going to be totally fresh every single test. So every time we run a test, after the test is done, it will erase the database, and then when the next test starts, you have to start over. So it actually has this refresh database trait here that we are currently not using. And the reason for this trait is that same thing that I just explained, is that we need to refresh the database after every single test. Think of it as if you're going to perform surgery, so of course you want a clean slate and you want every single tool cleaned out and left completely sanitized. So that's how it is. We want a clean state of our application before every single test. So after every test, we need to tear everything down and start over in the next test. So let's set that up now. Let's go back to this PHPUnit.xml file. We can actually use an in-memory SQLite. Obviously, we've been using SQLite for our project, but we can set up an in-memory one instead. That way it's not using our actual file. So in this PHPUnit file, we did disable Telescope on here, but if you noticed what these are environment variables. Anything in your .env file can be overwritten just for your test. So in my case, this is what I'm interested in, this DB connection. So I'm going to override DB connection just to make sure that it is always SQLite. Then on top of that, I want to make sure that the database that we are using is in memory. So we can say DB database, and then to put an in memory, you put :memory:. And now that's it. So every single test is going to use these variables right here. So whenever you need to set a particular configuration for testing only, this is where you add them, to the PHPUnit.xml file. All right, let's head back here to the test. And who are we going to be acting as? Well, technically, we don't have any users. Our database is empty. But if you remember, we talked about model factories already. We are able to generate any user that we want using a factory. And that's the real reason for factories, is actually for testing. So let's go ahead and whip up a user right now. Let's say factory, give me a new user, and go ahead and persist it to the database. Now, I'm going to run into an error, but I'm going to continue to write the test. So now we are technically logged in, right? Because we are acting as one of the users in our application. So let's go ahead and copy this. And this time, when we visit /customers, because we are logged in, I don't expect a redirect anymore, but rather I expect the status to be a 200. So we can just say assert OK. Make sure that everything went OK. All right, we're going to run into an error right here, but let me go ahead and run this test. So go ahead and run vendor bin PHPUnit and then your method name. And there it is. So this is the error that I was talking about. Now we have no such table users. If you recall, we talked about this already. We need to use this refresh database trait. So whenever you get this error, remember there is a completely fresh database in our system when the test is running. So we need to migrate our database. So to migrate our database, all we need to do is just use this refresh trait. So let's say use refresh database trait, just like that. Just that command right after your curly bracket, and let's run that test again. And now we get a green. So now we know that only logged in users can see that page, and we also know that if you are authenticated, then you do get to see that page. So what else can we test? Let's go back to this controller and let's see what else we can put under test. What about this store method? So if all of the correct data is sent to our store method, we do expect a new customer in our database. So let's see how we can achieve that. Let's go to the web routes PHP file and let's check out this customers right here. So as we see here, when we hit /customers as a post request, we do hit that store method. Great. So let's go back to our test and let's add a new test for a customer can be added through the form. Okay. So do we need to be acting as somebody? Yes, we do. We need to make sure that we are logged in. So we'll add that in at the top and then we'll say response equals this. Remember, this time it's not a GET request, but it's actually a POST request. So we're going to be hitting the /customers, and then we need to pass in an array of data. So as a second parameter, we can pass in an array of data. So what data is required? Well, if we go to the validate request, we see that we need a name, email, active, and a company ID. So let's fill those out really quick. Let's say a name, test user, an email, we'll just say test@test.com, active, we'll set that equal to 1, and then we need a company ID. We'll also set that equal to 1. We actually don't have a company in our database at this point, but we'll just do that as a 1. All right, so then we could say this assert count. So let's grab the customer and grab all of our customers in our database. And I want to assert that there is a count of 1 when we fetch all of the customers in our database. Now, customer as a class is getting imported up here at the top as use app customer. So just to make sure, if you get a customer was not found, make sure you import that class. So let's go ahead and try to run this test and see what happens. All right, so we get an error. We failed asserting that the actual size of 0 matches the expected size of 1. So obviously something went wrong with our application and we were unable to do that. So this cryptic message here is not going to help us at all. And the reason for that is that Laravel behind the scenes is actually doing something called exception handling. So it's actually kind of covering up the error for us. So let's go back to PHP Storm and let's turn that off. So we could say this without exception handling. It's just a method call. And if we add this line right here, now Laravel will no longer handle those for us. And I think our error is going to change. Let's try it again. There we go. All right, so now we got a much different error. And the error that we're getting is this action is unauthorized. Of course, we did not authorize this user to perform that action. All right. Now, if you remember in our customer policy, in order for you to create, your email has to be admin@admin.com. Those are the only people allowed to do that, right? And so in our controller, right here, right in the store method, the very first line is we authorize that request. But this is failing because our user right now that we are generating, whoever this acting as user is getting a random email. So we can actually override any of the fields inside the factory using the create method. Inside the create method, we can pass an array and override any of the fields. And then let's go ahead and give them admin@admin.com. So what that's going to do is the factory is going to generate everything except this email. Then it's going to use whatever we passed into the email instead. All right, let's try that again and see if we get any errors. So that worked. However, we get these messages here. And if you remember, that's because we're actually firing an event. When everything ran, it actually ran through our event. And it did fire this event. But in testing, we may not want to fire an event. So how could we tell Laravel, go ahead and forget about any events? So in testing, there's something called fakes, which means that you could basically replace one class with a different class so that it's basically a dummy class instead. So we can actually get rid of this without exception handling because we know our test is actually running. So what we can do is we can call the event facade, and that's going to be illuminate support facades and then event, and then we can call fake. This is a built-in feature of Laravel that allows us to fake any events. And if you're looking up here at the top, that is imported. So make sure that you are importing the correct facade. All right, so let's run that test again. Notice how it took 10 seconds. That's a long time for a single test. Let's run this again and see what happens. There we go. So much faster, 400 milliseconds, and we did not fire that event. So far, we've ran one test at a time. But if you want to run the entire file, then of course you could just say customers test. Just copy the class name instead. So let's run that, and instead of passing in a particular method, let's go ahead and pass in a class name. And there we go. So now we have 3 tests, which we know that, and we've asserted 4 things. So figure that you are refactoring your code and all of a sudden you say, you know what? I don't need this authorization here anymore. And you delete that out of your controller entirely. When you run your test, boom, there it is. That is sort of the premise of testing. If you're able to delete some code and it doesn't break your tests, it means that you're not covering that. So that's important. That's a good test for you to know. That's when you realize, well, I really do need that line of code because obviously under test, that is necessary. All right, let's just do one more test as this lesson is getting kind of long. So let's do one more. How about this? How could we maybe validate that this validation is happening? So that would be a cool test. I want to make sure that each of these fields is validated. So if tomorrow I say, well, do I really need this? And I erase it, I realize that yes, I do in fact need that. So let's do a quick validation test. So let's say something here. What I will actually do is take this array. I'm going to need to use it over and over. Think of this array right now as sort of valid data, 100% valid data. So let's go ahead and just put that out in its own method, and I'm just going to call it data. Let's make a private function and call it data, and it's just going to return that array, right? Nothing crazy. So I make a change. Let's go back to the test. Let's run them again. Yep, we're still green. All right, let's keep going. So that refactor was successful. So now let's write a new test. And let's just say test a name is required. We're going to need all of this again. So let me grab everything. And let's go and start to modify this. So obviously we're going to be still acting as this person. But now instead of just this data, what I could do is I could say array merge. Go ahead and array merge what you get from this data. But I want to override the name and just have an empty string instead. So let's see how we can test this. We can actually use this response right here to make sure that we have an error. So let's say response assert it has an error for name. How about that? So the name needs to have an error. Let's go ahead and run this. And sure enough, it does pass. But of course, we want to make sure that we actually have 0 customers. And the reason we want to assert that we have 0 customers is because if a name was not provided, then of course, I don't expect the database to have a customer. So that makes total sense. Let's go ahead and run that test, and we're back to green. All right, so that one is passing. How about this? Let's make sure, if you remember, the next rule was that it needs to be at least 3 characters. Let's put that under test. So a name is at least 3 characters. So now I'm going to override the name and just pass in just a single character. So I still expect that to fail. So let's do that now. Let's run that test. So we run our test and we still get green. Of course, because that is still required. All right, so now let me see that fail. What if I removed these 2 rules altogether? Let me go back here, run the test, and yep, we have 2 failures. So we expected the name to be required, and it wasn't. That failed. And then a name is at least 3 characters, also failed. So then let's add required back in and go back here. And now we have 1 test failed. A name is at least 3 characters failed because, of course, it needs to be a minimum of 3 characters. And now we're back to green. Great. Now this up here, right? This is kind of becoming a little bit cumbersome. As you can tell, we're basically doing the same exact thing every single time. So why don't we extract that somewhere else? How about this? Let's start with this event fake. So at the top of my test, I can actually override the setup method. So if we override the protected function setup, and it does require this return type, then we can maybe put that event fake up here instead. So let's do event : fake. And now we can remove that from each individual test, because what happens is that the setup method gets run before every single test. So any data or anything that you need to do before you run a test, that's where it would go. There is a setup method and there's also a teardown method. So if you need anything after you finish your test, that's where it would go. So now that we have that up here, that cleans up our test a little bit. So now let me go ahead and extract this as well. Let's extract this to a new method of, let's just call it acting as admin. So acting as admin, I'm going to do the full refactor. Go ahead and replace, go ahead and replace. There we go. So PHP Storm makes that a breeze. So now, instead of having all that complicated code, all I'm saying is this: acting as an admin, acting as an admin, and acting as an admin. And now we have a new method up here for acting as an admin. So let's clean this up. Let's get rid of that and let's actually make it private. So that way nobody can really access this. This is not really a concern. I'm actually going to move it down here. Now let's run the test again. We did a big refactor, but we have our test to back everything up and say, you know what? Everything is still running good. Great. Let's keep going. Let's do that email. So now an email, we could say an email is required. All right, so acting as an admin, I'm going to go ahead and send a blank email field. And now I expect to see an error for email, and I expect my database to not have any records. All right, let me run the test. And we pass. Great. Now, I also expect that to be a valid email. I repeated the test. Let's go ahead and change it to a valid email is required. So now let's just put here some text, test, test, test. And let's run the test. And yep, we still pass. So if we were to take off, for example, the email validation, and we run our test, then of course it fails because that was not required. And same thing, if we take off the requirement, then we have 2 failures. Great. So we're doing great. Let's get back to green. So there we go. So that, guys, that is a very basic example of testing and how to get it controllers under test. So there is a lot more to testing, and we're going to continue to explore testing in a future course. But for now, just know the basics of PHPUnit and what testing does. And once you get into the rhythm of testing, I promise you, you'll never want to write a line of code ever again without writing a test first. So with that, that's it for today's lesson. I'll catch you on the next one.